I still remember that night clearly, though I wish I didn't. I wasn't someone prone to fear or jumping at shadows, but that night something changed. The route I had taken hundreds of times became a haunting memory I can't shake. I was on my way back from a work trip, the kind that drags into late evening because a last-minute meeting gets extended far too long. It was well past midnight, and I had a long drive ahead of me through the more isolated stretches of the highway. The first couple of hours were uneventful, just me, the car, and the open road. There were no streetlights, just the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness, and the occasional distant glow of another vehicle on the opposite side of the highway. The radio was my only companion, but as I started to get deeper into the countryside, the stations began to fizzle out. By the time the static had completely drowned out the last song, I was surrounded by nothing but silence. I tried not to think about how empty the highway was. I'd driven through this stretch before, but something was unsettling about it at night, especially when you're alone. The trees on either side of the road seemed like looming figures in the dark, their twisted branches resembling hands reaching out, but that was just my imagination getting the best of me. At least, that's what I thought at first. It was around 1 a.m. when I first saw him. At first, I didn't think anything of it, a lone figure standing by the side of the road. There are always drifters or hitchhikers on highways like this, though it's rare to see them this late at night. My headlights caught him for just a second as I rounded a bend in the road, his silhouette illuminated briefly before I passed him by. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned trench coat. His head was slightly lowered, and he was facing away from the road, staring into the trees. Something about him made me shiver, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the stillness of his figure, like he had been standing there for hours without moving. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling creeping up my spine. It was late, and I was tired. My mind was probably playing tricks on me. I continued driving, hoping to forget about it. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the strange unease I felt. The highway was long and desolate, with no exits or rest stops for miles. The occasional car would pass me in the opposite direction, but other than that, it was just me, my car, and the road stretching out into the night. I tried turning the radio back on, hoping for some distraction, but all I got was static. I fiddled with the dial until I found a faint signal, a late-night talk show discussing urban legends and ghost stories. Normally, I would have laughed it off, but that night, the stories felt a little too close to home. Maybe 15 minutes had passed when I saw him again. The same man, standing by the side of the road, this time a little closer to the pavement. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way I could have passed him again. I hadn't taken any turns or exits. It was the same highway, the same stretch of road, and yet there he was, standing perfectly still, just like before. His coat billowed slightly in the wind, but otherwise he was motionless, facing away from the road. I slowed down a bit as I passed, peering through the window, trying to get a better look. He didn't turn to face me, but I could feel him watching me, even though his back was turned. A chill ran down my spine, and I pressed my foot down on the gas, eager to put some distance between me and the strange figure. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe there were two drifters dressed similarly, or maybe I had just been driving too long and was seeing things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. It was the same man. It had to be. As I drove on, my grip tightened on the steering wheel. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road behind me. The dark highway stretched out behind me, empty and silent, but that didn't ease the knot of fear growing in my chest. Another 20 minutes passed, and I was beginning to relax, convincing myself that I had imagined the whole thing. The night had a way of playing tricks on people, especially when you're tired. But just as I was starting to calm down, I saw him again. This time, he was standing even closer to the road, his figure looming larger in my headlights as I approached. He was no longer facing the trees. He was turned toward the road, toward me. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. I slowed down, almost against my will, my eyes glued to the figure. My car crept past him, and for a split second, I thought I saw his mouth move, like he was whispering something. But I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my racing heart. And then, just as I passed him, I heard a soft thud against the side of my car. It wasn't loud, just a faint tap, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. I slammed on the brakes and whipped my head around, scanning the road behind me. Nothing. There was no one there. The road was empty, the man nowhere in sight. I sat there for a moment, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't want to get out. Every instinct screamed at me to stay in the car, to keep driving, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door and stepped out, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I walked around the car, my eyes darting around the dark road and the trees beyond. There was no sign of him. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. I checked the side of the car where I'd heard the thud, but there was nothing, no dents, no scratches, nothing. It was like he had never been there. I got back into the car, my heart still pounding in my chest. I locked the doors, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference if he was out there. I started the car and sped off, my eyes glued to the road ahead. I didn't care how fast I was going, I just wanted to get out of there. But the highway seemed endless, stretching out before me like a black ribbon into the unknown. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was past 2 a.m., but it felt like I had been driving for days. I just needed to make it to the next town, the next gas station, anywhere with people, with lights, with safety. And then I saw him again. This time, he was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt just a few feet away from him. My heart was in my throat, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. He stood there, completely still, his face hidden in the shadows of his coat. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at him, waiting for him to make the first move. And then, slowly, he began to walk toward me. Panic surged through me. I threw the car into reverse, my foot slamming down on the gas as I backed away from him. But no matter how far I reversed, he kept coming closer, his pace slow and deliberate. I could feel my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind racing for a way out. I had to turn around and find another way off this highway, but there was no space to turn. Suddenly, he stopped. He stood there, just a few feet away from my car, his face still hidden. And then, in one swift movement, he lifted his head. For the first time, I saw his face. It was pale, almost ghostly, with sunken eyes that seemed to bore into me. His mouth was twisted into a cruel smile, and as he stared at me, I realized that his lips were moving again, whispering. But this time, I could hear him. "Come back," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "You can't leave." I threw the car into drive and sped forward, swerving around him as I gunned it down the highway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could do was keep driving, the words, "You can't leave," echoing in my mind. I drove for what felt like hours, the adrenaline coursing through me keeping me awake. But no matter how far I drove, the road seemed endless. The trees blurred together in the darkness, and the sky above was an impenetrable black void. There were no signs, no exits, no other cars. Just me and the road. And then, up ahead, I saw him again. I don't know how, but he was there, standing by the side of the road just like before. The same trench coat, the same pale face, the same twisted smile. My heart sank. I was trapped. I realized, with growing horror, that no matter how far I drove, I would never escape him. I would never leave this highway. I don't know how long I kept driving. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The man appeared again and again, always ahead of me, always watching. I stopped looking at him. I stopped trying to make sense of it. All I could do was drive, hoping that somehow, I would find a way out. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I saw an exit. It was barely visible, hidden among the trees, but it was there. I didn't hesitate. I swerved onto the exit ramp, the tires screeching as I finally left the highway behind. I don't know how I made it home that night. The rest of the drive was a blur, but somehow, I managed to find my way back. I parked the car in my driveway and stumbled inside, too exhausted to think, too shaken to process what had happened. I collapsed onto my bed, my mind still racing. But as I drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in my mind, haunting me. You can't leave. I haven't driven that stretch of highway since that night. I've avoided it at all costs, taking the long way around even if it adds hours to my trip. I don't care. I'll never drive that road again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear his voice.